Hi, Sherry, and thank you so much for joining us here today to talk a little bit more about your study. And I wondered if we could start with was the motivation behind this study for you?
Well, I was sitting around last spring and looking at all the things that were going on with the recession and how creative different revenue management people had become. And I started thinking, well, what are we going to look like 5 years from now? So let's stop focusing on all the horrible stuff that's been going on and let's look into the future.
Great. And what kind of methodologies did you use to start to bring all of this data together?
It was a really fun study. I did 3 different things. One was I did an online interview, and then the online survey, so I had about 500 respondents. Then I also did a series of phone interviews with people, which were turning into podcasts, and then also some video interviews. So it's really been a lot of fun.
Great. Lots of multimedia type information, I guess, to choose from and use.
Yes, and what was also really fun about it was talking with people from all over the world and finding that really we're all pretty much the same with our attitudes on this.
Great. And so can you summarize for us what your key findings were after you've spent this time gathering this information?
Well, one of the things that comes out is that people think that revenue management is going to be much more strategic in nature and much more technologically driven. And what's kind of underlying all of that is that people seem to think that revenue management for hotels is not just going to be applied to guest rooms, it's going to be applied to all areas of the hotel, which has a lot of implications for the way we organize things and the way we go into the future.
Is there one particular part outside of rooms that is really going to focus as a priority in the next 5 years, do you think?
The thing that came out loud and clear was function space. Now, of course, doing function space revenue management, as you know, is easier said than done.
So what did you find surprising about the results? I think that's always interesting. Maybe what questions you wished you had asked when you got all the way through this study?
The most surprising thing to me was I asked a question on how would performance be measured in the future. And now we typically focus in on RevPAR. And what just astounded me was that less than 20% of the respondents thought that RevPAR would be our performance metric in the future. I mean, that was really something I wasn't expecting to see.
Is there, as you've kind of accumulated the data together, are you already thinking about what questions you're going to ask the next time we look at 5 years ahead?
Well, right now, I guess I'm looking at it in 2 different levels. One is areas of research that I want to focus on now because the function space revenue management is something I think is very interesting to look at in a little bit more depth. And then the other thing is this performance measurement. Exactly how are we going to go about doing that if we switch from RevPAR to some other sort of metric?
So can you comment on the pace of change you've observed in revenue management over the last few years? What do you feel is going to happen as we look forward?
Well, it seems like it's picked up, and I think part of the reason that the pace has picked up was that during the recession, people had to get a lot more creative with how they were approaching revenue management. And I think now that we're kind of coming out of it, that revenue management people are looking back and going, I think there's a lot of other things that we might be able to do, and let's continue with this in the future as things get better. But it does seem like things have picked up. Another reason I think that's happened is that the technology is allowing us to do a lot of those sorts of things, whereas 5 years ago we might not have been able to do it as quickly.
Right. As far as the adoption goes of revenue management, we often talk about early adopters to technologies and things like that. And recently I've heard people talk about maybe it's okay to be a fast follower as well. Do you see things changing in how hotels are approaching actually bringing revenue management into their hotels?
Yes, I do, and I especially see this with our students and the ones who are graduating looking for jobs. Whereas before they might have to kind of earn their stripes, so to speak, and work in operations. A lot of the major hotel chains are seeing that they've got bright young people, and let's put them into revenue management right away. I think another thing that's changing is that, and this came through in the survey as well, is that people have seen the successes that they've had with rooms revenue management, and a lot of discussion on, well, why don't we just take those same concepts and apply it to other parts of the hotel.
Are you hearing from your students that go out into the real world? Is it easier, do you think, now to kind of bring in that whole revenue management culture than maybe it has been in previous years as the rest of the industry has caught up?
I think so, because a lot of times our students, they come out and they've learned a lot of cutting edge stuff, and then they get a job somewhere and they're 22 years old and it's not quite caught up to what they know, and so they have to kind of sit there, hold their tongue, and it's sometimes very frustrating. Now, though, so many chains have very well developed revenue management systems. I mean, things are moving a little bit more quickly, and they're putting those sorts of people into more responsible positions, which is fantastic.
Right, great. So as we look forward, are there different ways that people are going to measure their success using revenue management technology and analytics?
Well, I think part of this, as I said, less than 20% of people thought it was going to be RevPAR. And the most popular answers were total revenue per available room or even GOP per available room. And I think where this is coming from, again, is looking back to how people think that revenue management is going to be applied to all areas of the hotel. And because of that, just looking at rooms revenue isn't going to be enough. It's going to be misleading. And, the way, and some people even said lifetime value. I mean, there's all sorts of different things, but there was a real focus on looking at all revenue streams rather than just rooms.
Do you think that with these new measures, the industry will really bring those measures together that we could use across different properties, or will that take some time to actually get to a new standard? We've used RevPAR for so long.
I think it's probably going to take some time. I mean, the total revenue per available room, there's actually some data on there. If you look at the STAR reports, they have data on rooms, F&B, and other for some of the higher end hotels. GOP PAR, I think that's going to be a lot more difficult because, different chains measure their profitability and the timing of everything sort of differently. But I think, the total revenue, I think there's some potential for that one. The other thing that came out of this whole revenue, looking at all the different revenue streams, is that I think it's going to change, and this is what the respondents thought, it's really going to change the way revenue management's organized, not only at the property, but also, for the corporate offices and regional offices.
So we hear that a lot about where does revenue management sit in a hospitality organizational structure. Did that come out in this study as well? Did you have any conversations about where you think that might be going in the future?
Oh, definitely. And it was not only with the interviews, but also with the online survey. People seem to think that revenue management is going to be in a separate department. The reason for that is that they think that since it's looking at all different revenue streams, it can't be in rooms or it can't be in sales and marketing, because you've got to be able to look at all of these and be objective. The other thing that came through very loud and clear was that people think that there's going to be starting to become more centralization of revenue management, or maybe a hybrid model, and so you're going to have a lot more at the corporate or regional office, and maybe only the really large, complex properties might be having revenue management on site. And a lot of this has to do with the analytical skills and communication skills, by the way, that a strong revenue manager needs to have, and there really aren't that many people like that in the world to be able to populate all of the different hotels around the world.
So that's really good news for students of yours who are coming out into the world, into this. As you look forward into the future, there's real opportunity out there.
And there's a lot of opportunity. And one of the things that came through with the interviews and the online survey as well is people were emphasizing not only the analytical skills. They said, of course you need to have that, but equally important were the communication skills. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because if you're looking across departments, and so you're having to talk to people in banquets and in restaurants and in rooms and in golf, you've got to be a pretty good communicator, because you've got to be able to talk with so many different people and sell your ideas. And so I think that's something that I was happy to see that, and I think my students will be happy to see that, but it's something that's kind of different than maybe it was 5 or 10 years ago.
So if you could summarize for us a couple of key takeaways, and maybe there are key takeaways for people who are in the jobs today, and maybe for some of the people who are in charge of building a revenue management culture in a particular hotel chain or in a particular environment.
I think the big thing, we're using the term, it's going to be more strategic in nature, but when it comes right down to it, is that we're going to be looking at all revenue streams. And so it's going to be a much bigger picture than our focus has always been on just rooms revenue. And once you start thinking about that, one of the things I talk about in my classes is that, basically every square foot of space you have in the hotel you've got the opportunity there to be able to generate some revenue. And our goal as revenue managers is to make sure that that gets done and gets done well. And so I think that came through again through the survey, and I think it's very exciting to kind of see how this is all going to play out in the future.
Right. So one last question. If you were running a hotel today, sharing all the information that you have, what would you be doing next? What would you do tomorrow to make sure you're in the best possible position? Oh,
that's a hard question. I think I would start looking at my other opportunities and look at my revenue mix in the hotel, and also look at what's bringing me the profit. And so what can I do to take these other skills that I've learned? And we do rooms revenue management really very well. How can I take those same things and try to start creating revenue streams and revenue in other parts of the hotel? And some of it is really pretty easy. When you start looking at, well, how do we do pricing for restaurants, or how do we manage our function space? Some of the basic concepts that we've used for rooms easily apply there. The challenge, of course, is talking people into looking at it in a different way.
Sure. Great. Well, we're really happy that we got a chance to sit down today and talk a little bit more about your study. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks for having me.